Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his military's recent airstrikes on Gaza are only the beginning. The Hamas-run health ministry says the attacks killed over 400 Palestinians, including many children. In Tel Aviv, families of hostages joined thousands protesting Israel's renewed Gaza offensive, accusing Netanyahu's government of sacrificing their relatives.
Displaced again. Setting up tents right in the middle of this square in Gaza City, hoping to find refuge from Israeli attacks. Palestinians here are surrounded by reminders that nowhere is safe.
Suddenly at night, the bombing began and shrapnel fell on us. We read on the Israeli military coordinator's page that Beit Hanun is a red zone. This is the fourth time we have been displaced from Beit Hanun.
Israel says it only targets Hamas terrorists and blames them for hiding in civilian areas.
Palestinian civilians should avoid any contact with Hamas terrorists. And I call on the people of Gaza, get out of harm's way, move to safer areas. Because every civilian casualty is a tragedy. And every civilian casualty is the fault of Hamas.
From now on, Israel will act against Hamas with increasing force. And from now on, negotiations will only take place under fire. Hamas has already felt the weight of our force in the last 24 hours. And I want to assure you and them, this is only the beginning.
But back home, Netanyahu's resolve is met with resistance. Thousands protested in Tel Aviv against the Israeli strikes on Gaza.
Do the government work for us? Do they care about us, the people? How come we feel like we want to be together? Israelis are such lovely people. What happened to us?
And what happens next? A question that neither Israelis nor Palestinians know the answer to, as Israel vows to press ahead until it achieves all of its war goals.
We can now speak to DW's Emily Gordine in Jerusalem. Emily, let's start by talking about Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks about this being only the beginning. This war has been going on for a year and 5 months. What does he mean?
Well, it ultimately means that we can expect more strikes in the future. Security officials in Israel say that this is somewhat of a rolling operation, meaning that it will stop and pause and resume in different stages, depending on the developments. Now, ultimately, Israel hopes that this will push Hamas to agree to the deal, the proposal that was put forth by US envoy Steve Witkoff, which so far it hasn't.
And the government has approved the reappointment of far-right politician Itamar Ben-Gvir as Minister of National Security. Now, he famously resigned in January in protest of the Gaza ceasefire deal. What signal does that send?
Well, Itamar Ben-Gvir left in January because he was opposed to the ceasefire deal. He's always wanted Israel to resume the war. He's a massive proponent of the settlement movement in Israel. He wants to see the resettlement of Gaza. And that is ultimately only possible if there's a permanent presence of the IDF in Gaza. And now we're seeing the resumption of the war. And that is something that is absolutely in his interest. And he has said in the past that if Israel does continue with the war, he will be happy to come back to the government. When he left the government with a very thin majority, and his move to now return to the government leaves it with leaves the government itself in a much stronger position in Israel's parliament.
What happens to the ceasefire talks now? What are you hearing?
Well, I mean, the first phase of the ceasefire deal ended in March, and ever since negotiations over the second phase of the deal have somewhat stalled. We've seen no breakthrough negotiations in Doha and in Cairo. Over the past few weeks, Steve Witkoff, the US envoy, put forth a proposal that would essentially somewhat of a bridging proposal that would see the extension of the first phase of the deal. It would see the release of the remaining hostages in Gaza. It would also see a resumption of aid flowing into the Gaza Strip, which Israel has halted, and it would also see the further release of Palestinian prisoners. But the sticking point here seems to be the fact that it does not mention a permanent end to the war, which is left to future negotiations, and that is something that the two sides have been unable to bridge.
DW's correspondent in Jerusalem, Emily Gordine. Thanks, Emily.
For more, let's bring in Hans-Jakob Schindler from the International Counter-Extremism Project. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has collapsed. Was this inevitable? What I'm trying to get at with there is, was this Israel's plan for a while now, or was this an unexpected breakdown in negotiations?
No, unfortunately, it was always clear that when the first political questions of seriousness are going to be asked, it's going to be very hard for both sides. In the first phase of a deal, this was a very operational deal. There was a very clear negotiated system of how many hostages when, against how many prisoners when from each side. So each side really just implemented the operational plan without having to move on any of their positions. It was very clear that in the second phase, we will enter a conundrum if the permanent management of the Gaza Strip is not yet decided. So who is supposed to run the Gaza Strip? Obviously, Hamas wants to run the Gaza Strip. Israel, for very good reasons, after October 7th last year, in 2023, cannot let Hamas run the Gaza Strip. But they have also not yet decided who else. So the second phase of the deal, which reviewed a complete withdrawal of the Israeli army without having that question answered, would have meant a handover of the Gaza Strip to Hamas. And so here we are. The Israelis and the Americans proposed a continuation of phase one, so a continuation of the ceasefire and the exchange of the remaining hostages and dead hostages for some Palestinian prisoners. Hamas refused that, fully knowing that if there is no answer, they will stay in power. And unfortunately, here we are, the resumption of hostilities.
Okay, so what we're seeing now appears to be a return to a full-scale war, if I'm not mistaken. From your perspective, we've seen these protests in Tel Aviv, but that doesn't represent all of Israel. There's a lot of hard-right factions in Israel that want to see a full-scale war. They want to see Netanyahu, quote, finish the job. So how much of this is military strategy and how much is domestic politics for the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu said he uses these airstrikes as an additional pressure point on Hamas to continue to release hostages, i.e. continue what the deal was in the first phase, not to discuss the second phase, because once the deal would enter officially the second phase, then he knows he's not only using one minister, he's losing the second minister and therefore losing majority in the Knesset and breakdown in government. So there's also a political challenge, which Prime Minister Netanyahu has not yet effectively addressed internally in his cabinet, that it would break down as soon as there is a political discussion about the Gaza Strip. So he also has a domestic conundrum to square the round peg here.
Extremism expert Hans-Jakob Schindler, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.